In this lecture module, we're going to narrow our focus to that first step, to trying to identify bits of written or spoken language that likely contain arguments for the purposes of ultimately extracting those arguments. However, before we do that, I want to take a moment to discuss the overarching goals and the ultimate result that we want out of this process of identifying, extracting, and ultimately evaluating arguments. The overarching goal that we need to adopt when we're trying to identify and extract an argument is to understand and assess a person's reasoning through the adoption of a principle of charity. That is, we want to approach our attempts to understand that person, whether it's ourselves or whether it's someone else, in a way that tries to understand them as rational, as informed, as offering up an argument in good faith. We want to portray them in the best possible light. That should be our overarching methodological principle here. And the result, the end that we want to achieve through this process, is to create a sympathetic and impactful version of their reasoning that's consistent with their intention and their perspective. Now, this can be a very difficult thing to do. There are all sorts of roadblocks that may arise when we're trying to create a sympathetic and impactful version of someone else's reasoning, even of our own reasoning, maybe at times. We can be caught up in the argumentative moment and have a difficult time detaching ourselves from our passion about the issue at the moment. We may be naturally unsympathetic to their views or their values. We may not share their perspective. We may doubt their intention. If we are not sympathetic or we strongly disagree with someone, we might be very hesitant or even resistant to doing their work for them, to creating a better version of their argument when we could just simply dismiss their current version that we view as weak or inadequate without further effort. And finally, and this is probably the most abstract difficulty, oftentimes it's difficult when we're trying to create a version of an argument to detach ourselves from that creation and not to create a version of the argument that we would like to present or a version of the argument with the conclusion that we would want. Our goal here is to present their argument consistent with their perspective, their intention, and their beliefs. And so we always need to keep that in mind. What we're creating isn't what we would necessarily endorse. It may not be the way in which we would approach the problem. It may not be the conclusion that we would arrive at. But our goal isn't to create an argument for us from our own perspective. Our goal is to create an argument that represents this other person's perspective in as sympathetic and as impactful a manner as possible. Now, you might be thinking, gee, Wallace, that's very open-minded and pro-social of you, but why would we invest so much effort to create something that is so completely alien from our own perspective and argumentative intention? Now, to start, we're not just going to be doing this for other people. We want to do this with our own arguments. We want to think about our own reasons for our views or our values or our decisions and treat them in the same way. But we also want to be able to engage constructively with people who have quite different perspectives, different values, who've made different choices. And we want to do so by understanding them on their terms, not agreeing with them, not accepting them uncritically, but knowing who they are, where they are, not detaching them from their humanity or from their rationality, but instead engaging with them, keeping those things at the very forefront. Now that I've discussed particular methodologies, rationales, and goals for the way I approach identifying and extracting arguments, let's turn our attention to that first rule in the 4 rules, identifying whether or not a bit of spoken or written language is likely to contain an argument. There are really two kinds of evidence that we can use in trying to make that assessment. The first kind of evidence is a overall or holistic or contextual assessment of what the speaker or the author intends to do. Do they want to convince you of some point of view, get you to adopt a course of action? Are they trying to rebut something someone else said? Are they trying to show a connection between ideas? All of these things can be seen when you get used to looking at a particular context for those kinds of author or speaker intents. But they're not mechanical and they're not sort of superficial things that we can just list off and check off on a sheet of paper. So the best way to develop that assessment based on these contextual elements is to keep making those judgments and seeing if in fact the judgments that you're making are good or bad. Trying to cultivate an ability to make those kinds of speaker intention assessments. In the meantime, and in a way that is much more mechanical, though no more diagnostic, you can rely on orthographic or superficial features of what the speaker says or what the speaker writes. So oftentimes, a speaker, particularly when they're making an argument, will use certain words or phrases to indicate the role of a particular statement in that argument. Premise indicators are phrases, words that suggest that evidence is about to be given. Conclusion indicators are words or phrases that suggest that a conclusion has been drawn or is about to be drawn. Now, the difficulty, as we'll see with these, is that's not their only function in the language, but they are used this way, and they are easier to identify than an author or a speaker's intention. Similarly, we talked about conditional statements, and conditional statements have this structure of relating an antecedent statement to a consequent statement. That is to say, if my antecedent is true, then my consequent is true. And because conditional statements link two statements together specifically in terms of their truth values, then they often appear in argument passages in spoken language that contains arguments. But again, a conditional statement isn't a definitive bit of evidence that someone is giving an argument. People use conditionals even when they're not intending to offer you an argument. There are other logical form words that we'll see when we look at the counterexample methods section of the Hurley text. Those words also suggest that an inference or an argument is being offered up in this particular context.